session in our webinar series, Fundamentals of Project-Based Language Learning. Today, our presenter for all three lessons is Cherise Montgomery, professor at Brigham Young University. Cherise, how's your audio?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear, so I'm just going to hand over to you and you go right ahead.
Great. Today we're going to be talking about one of the topics that many of you have asked lots and lots of questions about, and that's the idea of scaffolding. We're going to look at it in three chunks: scaffolding interpretive communication, scaffolding interpersonal communication, and scaffolding presentational communication. And let's see if we can get this to go. So a lot of times when we think about scaffolding, and I guess I should start by saying some of you may have seen pieces of this before, but I have augmented the examples for this particular presentation. So a lot of us, when we think about helping students to develop language proficiency, think of it in terms of linguistic Legos. Specifically, in a project-based language learning context, we're interested in helping our learners to create with language in real-world settings for authentic audiences and purposes. And one of the comments that we keep getting is, well, my students don't know enough to do that in the real world with their language. And hopefully by the end of these sessions today, you will come to understand that maybe it's just that learners need different pieces, different Legos than the ones we typically think of when we're thinking about language learning. If we look at the actual proficiency guidelines, and this happens to be the superior level, so if we're trying to get students to advanced levels of proficiency, there are a number of things that they have to be able to do by the time they get there. And that includes that they need to be able to talk about a variety of themes and disciplines. And that's true even at the novice level. Eventually, they need to be able to talk about social and political issues, to be able to speak in formal and informal settings from multiple perspectives, ask questions, describe, narrate, state and support opinions, and hypothesize, and be able to talk in abstract ways and to negotiate meaning. These are all things that project-based language learning supports very nicely. And if we had to summarize all of that, one of the key things that we might need to recognize is the idea that all of those functions basically revolve around students being able to work in authentic contexts, to use content, and to think critically. And if they can't do those three things, they're going to have difficulty irrespective of how sophisticated their language is. That's one of the reasons that we have native speakers who don't necessarily achieve a score of superior or distinguished on the actual OPI. So if we look at what that means or try to deconstruct what that means in terms of proficiency, we can see that we need to progressively move students from being able to communicate with isolated words and phrases through the point where they can actually build a logical argument. We want to move their language functions from labeling and listing in formulaic ways to the point where they can circumlocute or eventually state and justify and defend opinions. And what they talk about needs to change from common basic survival needs to increasingly broader topics at increasingly abstract levels. If we hope to help students do that, they need a lot of support. And so today we're going to be talking about different types of support that we might want to use to help students to shift their proficiency forward. Those might include everything from word walls and password phrases and templates, or teaching them how to make sentences by combining and substituting using formulas, to more things like using transitional words and sentence frames, helping them become more introduced to academic vocabulary or idiomatic expressions. So we're going to look at some specific strategies for helping them to do that. But the main idea here is that we want them to have bite-sized chunks of complexity. So what do we mean when we say scaffolding? Scaffolding is essentially the distance between what a learner can do alone and what the learner can do with adult guidance or collaboration. So in other words, it's the supports that I put in place as the teacher for learners who may not have the knowledge, the confidence, or the language skills to succeed autonomously. And notice it's not just about language here. In some cases, the scaffolding that we're putting in place is to build confidence or to address knowledge gaps in our learners. How teachers often think about scaffolding is kind of like this. We want to give them every grammatical explanation and all of the details about the language. But if you look at how learners think about scaffolding, they just want just enough information in order to be able to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. And they need that to happen in a variety of ways. So we're going to spend a few minutes analyzing how LEGO scaffolds things for students, and then looking at the implications of that for language teaching and learning. So if we take a look at this image, we can see this is kind of a great depiction of how LEGO scaffolds. And you'll notice here that there are a number of characteristics that each of these diagrams share. First of all, they are visual, which provides access, irrespective of how old the child is, irrespective of what language the child speaks. They can look at this and access the information. They are colorful. That's not incidental. They are colorful because LEGO is trying to guide students' attention or learners' attention to specific features of what it is that they're looking at. So you'll notice the red arrows are showing them that they are going to position one piece over the top of another. You'll notice that certain colors show them the colors of the pieces that they need to use. You'll notice that this is simple and sequential. Only one step is provided at a time. They don't show students the whole finished version all up front, although they can look at that, of course, at the end of the diagram. But each step is provided piece by piece. This allows students or learners to have autonomy as they are working through this project. And for those of you who have children or who have been around children playing with Legos, you'll probably recall that you've seen children as young as 3 or 4 putting really complex structures together all by themselves. This step-by-step approach helps learners to have the ability to perform complex tasks. And you'll notice it's so step-by-step that if there are multiple things that have to happen in a step, you'll notice the little tan call-out boxes make it possible for learners to see what to do in those spaces. If we look at this particular diagram, we can see that LEGO also helps students see the structure and sequence the content, and that's what we want to do for our learners. So we need to think about the conceptual content of the projects that we are engaging learners with, or the things that they might need to know or to understand in order to be able to accomplish the project. So we want to give them an overall idea of what it is we're trying to accomplish. Then we can provide the step-by-step instructions, and then we can move back to the whole overall idea again as we reflect on our learning. We want to move from the known to the unknown. So the things that students are already familiar with, and then progressively working toward things that they may not have as much experience with. Obviously, we want to build so that things move from becoming simple uses of language to progressively more complex uses of language. And we don't want to wait to do that. The goal is not to present all the language and then allow students to use it. Project-based language learning in particular lends itself to allowing students to acquire the language or to learn the language as they are in the process of working through the various tasks that comprise the project. We want to move from concrete to abstract, and we want students to focus on meaning first and then form. You'll notice that even the LEGO ads are comprehensible without the language. You can look at this and figure out what it's advertising, what kinds of things you might expect to see in the store or to be able to buy. And if you look at the third panel, you can tell where the store is. And you'll notice that the organization of the flyer or of the advertisement even structures that for you so that you can pay attention to each piece separately and individually. And we want to design the materials that we give students, whether that's worksheets or PowerPoint presentations or other kinds of scaffolding tools that we might use, so that they are equally comprehensible. One of the other key things we want to think about when we're thinking about scaffolding is the idea of cognitive load. And there are a number of things that as teachers we tend to do which increase the cognitive load, or in other words, the processing power that is required in order for learners to understand the language. When we give them lots of irrelevant information that they don't need until several steps later in the project, we are increasing the cognitive load because they're having to process what they're supposed to do right now, as well as all of the other details about things that will happen later. If we remove those irrelevant details and only focus on one thing at a time, we can increase students' ability to comprehend what it is that we are talking about. Highlighting key information and providing content in bite-sized chunks and being consistent in our structure are also things that we can do to decrease cognitive load. And then finally, presenting information and engaging students with content using multiple modalities so that they have access to text and images and audio and video of whatever it is that we're trying to teach. So we're now ready to kind of think about what are some of the layers that might be needed in order to support project-based language learning. And those layers span everything from scaffolding the individual content of a text to scaffolding process, the purposes and context, or even the culture of the classroom. So when we're looking at our project and trying to determine how do I scaffold this, we want to consider a couple of things. First of all, in order to accomplish the project, we need to think about what kinds of information do students need to find out? What kind of inquiry do they need to participate in? And then we're going to need to ask ourselves, as they are working through that inquiry, where are breakdowns likely to occur? And that's how we know where to put the support that we need. So let's take a look at what that might look like in each of these individual phases. First of all, students need to acquire information in order to be able to move forward with the project. In some cases, that will be information about the culture, where the project, with your partner, school, or collaborator. In some cases, that might be information about the topic. For example, if students are working on some kind of environmental project, then they may need information about the environmental needs and concerns of their own community or of the communities that they're working with. Or they may need information about the specific phenomenon that they're working with, whether that's water pollution or endangered species or whatever the case might be. Next, students need opportunities to process that information, and interpersonal communication is a great way to help them to do that. And so we'll be looking at some strategies that we can use to scaffold that talk. And then finally, they need opportunities to share the things that they have learned. And this is where the public audience comes in, and we'll be looking at some strategies and also technological tools that you can use to help them with that. So how do we scaffold interpretive inquiry? Now, obviously, in a language classroom, we would normally call this interpretive communication, but I've labeled it interpretive inquiry here because I want to emphasize that our purpose for having students read, listen to, or view information or texts in the target language is to support the inquiry process in project-based language learning. So if I'm engaging students in inquiry, what are some of the things that I need to do to help them with that? The first is that I need to activate and build their prior knowledge, help them help make the conceptual and cultural input comprehensible, and give them developmentally appropriate tasks. Then I want to give them opportunities to talk about what they've read or listened to or viewed so that they can comprehend the content and the culture as they think about it. And the critical thinking piece is a big piece of this phase. And then in the last phase, I want to give them opportunities to apply what they've learned, including the conceptual content and cultural ideas, in a new situation or to complete the project in ways that promote creative self-expression. So where can you find texts that students can read or engage with that might give them information about your topic? Here are just 2 or 3 websites, and we'll look at several. I'll post several others later. But there is a website that allows you to search different types of media by country and by region. And so you'll notice that you can look at different types of outdoor ads, different types of environmental ads, different types of TV spots. And so this is a great place to acquire culturally authentic information in a variety of languages. Students can gain a lot from infographics, and infographics are a great way to launch conversations and to launch inquiry, or to support inquiry. This site happens to be one that collects infographics in Spanish, but there are a variety of other sites, and if you search for infographics in your target language, you'll come across those. Museum is a great site that allows students to access the front page of today's newspapers. So whatever the current date is, it archives all of the front pages of those newspapers from countries around the world in languages around the world. And again, it's searchable by region, by country name, and even you can look in alphabetical order. And that includes both local newspapers from here in the United States as well as from other places. So if you're working on something related to current events and you want students to monitor the news, for example, or to look at things from how does Colombia look at environmental issues versus how does Peru look at environmental issues, they have the opportunity to start comparing and contrasting those perspectives. And of course, video clips are another great option. Learners make sense of the texts that they are engaging with through the lens of their own knowledge and personal experiences. And in fact, if you read just about anything on teaching reading, either in the first language or the second language, you'll find that prior knowledge is an absolutely critical component. If you are asked to read a text about something that you know nothing about, that reading will be much, much, much more difficult for you than if you're asked to read a text that you do know something about, even if it's in a language that you're not particularly proficient in. So when we're scaffolding input, we need to think about 3 key things. First, we want to provide learners with pre, during, and post-reading activities. Or in other words, when we hand learners a text and say, read this, and then you're going to use this information for your project, this is one of the reasons that reading breaks down in the language classroom. The same is true of listening and viewing. Learners need preparation for the text, and a lot of teachers are tempted to shortcut that preparation so that they have quote-unquote time for the text. But you'll find that if you'll invest more time in pre-reading activities, the during reading phase won't be as difficult for students because they will bring so much to the text. And we'll look at some specific examples of those in just a minute. The second piece is making multiple passes through the text for different purposes. Again, thinking about cognitive load, when a learner is first moving through a text that they don't know, and about which they don't know anything in terms of the topic, it becomes extremely difficult for them to decode the text, process the meaning of the text, decipher the conceptual content of the text, make sense of that conceptual content within the context of their own personal experiences, and also understand any cultural allusions that may be present in the text. And all of those things combined with just managing the language can make reading a process that a lot of students don't enjoy. And so by giving students multiple opportunities to move through the text for different purposes, we can eliminate a lot of that cognitive load, because now we're asking them to focus only on a single thing at a time, which allows them to devote all of their mental energy to that task. And over time, as they make repeated passes through the text, it positions them to increasingly acquire more and more information from the text each time. And the third piece is the idea of editing the task instead of the text. So instead of thinking that we have to rewrite texts so that they are comprehensible to students, we simply need to think about changing the tasks that we're giving them or providing a careful sequence of tasks so that the learner can eventually do what it is that they need to with the text. Typically when we think about reading a text, we think about handing the learner a text and saying, read this. And then they sit there quietly and they read with their eyes. There are lots of ways to turn reading into an interactive activity that actually supports and scaffolds learners' comprehension. And this is a list of just a few of them. So we'll be looking at specific examples of most of these, but I'll touch on a few right now. The idea of reader's theater would apply primarily to a fictional text, where you have different students playing the part of different characters and reading those aloud. A scavenger hunt is really good for any kind of text, but particularly for informational kinds of texts. So instead of having students read the whole text, maybe you're asking them to skim and scan in order to find 3 ways to accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish in your project, for example, or identify 3 different cultural beliefs about XYZ, whatever it is that you're doing in your project. So let's take a look at some of these. The first strategy is called hearsay, and this is an idea that is adapted from Helena Curtin. And basically with this idea, you give students, you put students in pairs, and each student is given half of the text. And the text is all mixed, well, actually each student is given the whole text, but the text is all mixed up. So I'm going to give you the example with numbers so that you can see how this would work. So if I'm student A, I begin because I have the star next to the number 1 under say. So I'm going to say whatever is in that column. And the first thing I say is 1 or uno or whatever the language is. Student B, has to look in the hear column to see what it was that they heard. So they heard me say 1, and they're going to follow that across the row with their finger to the say column to find out what to say next. So they will say 3. Student A heard 3, so they say 7. Student B heard 7, so they say 6. Student A heard 6, so they say 2. Student B heard 2, so they say 8. Student A heard 8, so they say 5. B heard 5, so they say 9. A heard 9, so they say 4. B heard 4, so they say 10. A hears 10, and we know that we're done because we're back to the beginning. Now you can take that same idea and apply it to an article that you want students to read. So this would be an example of a story, the Little Red Hen. And so person A starts by saying, encontré unos granos de trigo. ¿Quién quiere sembrarlos? Person B heard that, and they are going to have to find it over in the here column and follow it across. What this kind of an activity allows is for students to process bite-sized chunks of language. It allows them to practice negotiating meaning, because if they didn't hear what was said, they can ask to have it repeated, or they can ask questions for clarification. And it gives them an opportunity to practice listening in a little more authentic way that is carefully set up for them to have success. Jigsaw is another way that we can have students read texts. So in this scenario, each the entire class is divided into 4 large groups. And each group is given a different article about the topic that I want students to learn about in preparation for their project. And that group is going to read the article, or they might watch the video clip or whatever kind of media it happens to be that I'm giving them. And then as a whole group, they are going to discuss the meaning of the article or the video that they read or watched, and they're going to take notes on that as they talk together. And then they're going to give the original text back to me as the teacher so that they then have to rely on their notes. Then as a teacher, I'm going to help them form new groups of only 4 people in each group. Each group will contain a member of one of those larger groups. So there would be one number 1, one number 2, one from group 3, and one from group 4. And they're now responsible for teaching each other what they learned, or for sharing their learning. Now, if the teacher is strategic about this, and I'll show you a textual example of this in just a second, you can position students to actually be able to gain new information from each other because you have provided articles that each take a different perspective on the issue that you're asking them to explore, or that provide different bits of facts or information about the phenomenon that you're asking them to investigate. One of the other things that does is it provides a meaningful purpose for the reading. Say something is a strategy that gives students opportunities to make connections to their prior knowledge. So in this activity, everybody gets an article or a copy of the article, and the teacher has marked at various places on the article a little pair of lips which indicate that they're supposed to say something. So students get with a partner. They can read aloud or take turns reading aloud the various paragraphs, or they can read silently, whichever you prefer. And then when they get to one of those lips, one of those symbols, their job is to turn to their partner and say something about what they're reading. That can be a comment. They could give an example of whatever the reading is saying. They could share an experience. They could make a prediction, or they could ask a question. And so this is a really great way to help students actively engage with the content of the text using their own limited language. Story switches work in a similar way as the Jigsaw. So I would choose article A or B. I would read my article, take notes, give the article back to the teacher, and then I would share with a partner. If the teacher provides a particular template, so for example, maybe for some reason we're investigating ants and their various habits in preparation for some kind of project that we're doing with another country. And so I need students to find out about the habits of particular types of ants. Each of these articles provides different information in a pretty high interest way and using language that's relatively accessible to most learners if I have set up the activity well. And so by asking students to work together to talk about what they learned from their article, eventually they end up summarizing or synthesizing or consolidating the content of what it is that they have read as they create a shared set of notes. Table tense is a strategy that we can use when we have texts that we want students to read that we think are too difficult for them. So I could have students read part of a journal article or part of a magazine article. These articles that are shown on the screen all happen to be about identity and clothing. And so instead of having students read the entire bit of research, I might just take a quote out of the article and put it on a piece of paper or and fold the paper in half so that it sits on the table. And this way, students can work with a partner and walk around the room to read different quotes, or I can seat students at tables or at desks with a quote in the middle and ask them to choose, do they want to talk about quote A on the left-hand side of the paper or quote B on the right-hand side of the paper. So students choose whichever one, and I can set those up to make sure that they are at varying levels of reading difficulty. And then students have a chance to collaboratively discuss what that text means and figure that out together. So now that we've looked at some ways that you can have students actively and interactively engaging with the text, what are some of the things that might keep them from understanding the text? Typically, if I talk with teachers about this, they will generally say grammar and vocabulary. And what I'd like to do is to encourage you to think a little more deeply about it. And these are some of the things that keep students from being able to experience success when they're reading. Many times, the purpose of the text is unclear. And that creates problems because we select our reading strategies and we know what to pay attention to based on the purposes for which we are reading. And so if students are just reading because the teacher told them to, it makes it difficult for them to draw on those strategies. Sometimes students have a lack of prior knowledge, and this is probably the single biggest thing that makes things difficult for students to read. And so if we can build that prior knowledge, that can be very beneficial to them. They lack the base of oral language sometimes to understand what they're reading. So if they don't have experience with the words in the real world and in their daily lives, then it's difficult for them when they run across those words to go, oh yeah, I know what that means. And so providing them lots of physical, concrete experiences with the conceptual content of the text before they read can position them to be able to understand what they're reading once we give them the texts. Many students lack effective reading strategies, even in their first language. And so we want to give assignments with each text in our pre, during, and post-reading activities that are organized in such a way that they teach effective reading strategies with each successive text, so that over time students become more autonomous, independent readers. We want, a lot of times students don't have adequate genre awareness, and I'm going to give you some specific examples of this in just a minute. Sometimes they don't understand how the text is structured, and that makes it difficult for them to follow the text or to make predictions or to do the things that effective readers do. Academic language, they may have the basic understanding of the concepts, but they are unfamiliar with the academic terms that are being used or the more sophisticated ways that language is being used. And this isn't a question of teaching them grammar and vocabulary as much as it is pairing daily words with more academic examples. So one example might be students may be familiar with the word to turn, the verb to turn, but they may not be familiar with the verb to rotate. And so when I model using both of those words as synonyms, students have opportunities to start to develop the more academic language that they need for the readings that they're doing. The little words really get us in trouble. These are the conjunctions, and, or, because, and the transitional words, although, nevertheless, therefore. Many language teachers don't give as much attention to these as perhaps they should, because these words are very abstract, and that makes it in some ways difficult to teach them. And so as a result, we leave students without the key information that they need to be able to manage a text, because those little words are the words that signal relationships between ideas. They are the words that allow students to make predictions about what's coming next. They are the words that allow students to follow an argument and also to make inferences about what the author is saying. And they also happen to be among the words that are repeated in every single text and that are very, very predominant. And so if students acquire those little words, those transitional conjunctions and phrases, it positions them to make dramatic gains in their reading. And then the last piece is the issue of we don't scaffold the texts enough. So I think I'm going to pause there, and we'll take a couple of questions for maybe 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to look at some specific examples of texts and how a language teacher might scaffold those to help students read. So I'm going to kind of escape out of this so that I can see my console here.
Hi, Cherise. Stephen here. I'd like to note to everyone that the poll is open. So the poll should have popped up for this session. Please complete the poll. If you do not see the poll, please mouse over the green strip and towards the right, choose options, and then pull down for the poll. Cherise, I'm going to jump right in with some clarification questions.
Great.
The first one has to do with the listen and speak card sequence activity, where you had the icon of the ear and the icon of the lips, and
yes.
The students are taking cues from one another. One participant asked, in your example, the numbers are not continuous. In other words, it's sort of a nonsense sequence of numbers. But if we did it with a real text, then you use the actual order of the text. right? So that
correct. So the reason the numbers are not in sequence is because I wanted you to be able to see that you have to be able to hear it to know what comes next. So if I were to say 1, I didn't want you as the learners to know, oh, well, 2 comes after 1, so that's what's next. But in an actual text with words, I want the text to be set up so that it logically moves in order.
Right, okay. Now that that's cleared up, another question has to do with when you send students to do this interpretive reading as a source of information pointing towards the things that they need to know for their project, and then after they have dealt with the text, you want them to process the meaning of what they have gotten from the text through talking about it with each other, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so during that stage, one of the participants is wondering, at that point, do you do any interventions with regard to language form, or do you, as the participant put it, allow students to develop fluency at the expense of accuracy?
I would say neither, because I would frame that differently. I would say that whether or not I correct for accuracy depends upon my purpose for the activity. So if my goal is that I want students to be attending to the content of the article and to be discussing the content of the article, then my corrections in terms of accuracy are probably going to take place whenever I feel like the mistakes that they are making are interfering with the comprehensibility of what they're trying to communicate, or with their own understanding of the article. Whereas when we move to presentational communication and they're preparing to share with an authentic public audience, in the scaffolding for that, I'm going to be much more interested in accuracy because the purpose for their communication is different. It's a more formal setting. Not that we want them to be inaccurate in informal settings, but I think it positions them to pay more attention to those things, whereas when I'm asking them to process the content of the text, if they have to think about accuracy on top of the content, on top of figuring out what it is that they're trying to say, the cognitive load is too high. And that's one of the reasons that they jump out of the target language and into English, or whatever their first language might happen to be. So I can solve multiple issues during that processing phase by not addressing accuracy explicitly.